So before we start talking about any drawing techniques, we need to talk about materials. I have here a variety of different pencils and a couple different pens and sharpening materials. Let's start by talking about the pencils. You'll notice that your pencils have a number and a letter at the base of them. This is a 2H pencil. These numbers are an indicator of the hardness or softness of the lead. The harder the pencil, the lighter the line is that it naturally makes. The softer the pencil, the darker the line. So I'll start with the 2H. We're going to draw just a little bit with each pencil so that you can get an idea of what I mean by a harder or a softer lead. So the 2H, it's pretty light. I'm using just normal pressure. The HB is slightly darker, and then as we move along through the rest of them, B, 2B, 4B, and all the way up to 6B, you'll see that they get slightly darker. I'm not pressing any harder, it's just that the lead is softer, so more graphite is being picked up by the paper. You may find a 8B that's like the softest lead I've encountered. But I like to stay between 2H and 6B. You may also want to use pens when you're doing drawing. They give a totally different line quality, obviously. Ballpoint pen and Sharpie pen is what I have here, but you may also want to play around with brush pens as well. For sharpening pencils, obviously you can use a regular pencil sharpener, but an alternative would be an X-acto knife. So X-acto knife safety, always keep the lid on if you have one, and keep the blade facing away from you. I'm going to zoom in here and slow down the video so you can see a little bit better how to properly sharpen a pencil. So I am keeping the blade facing away from me, and I'm using my thumb to guide against the back of the blade and holding the blade almost parallel to the pencil. I'm going to very slowly shave away some of the wood up to the edge of that graphite. The benefit of sharpening with an X-acto knife is that you get a slightly different point. This point is flatter and wider than a typical sharpened pencil. When you're thinking about paper, one important thing to consider is the tooth of the paper. If you were to look really closely at paper, you would notice that it's not completely smooth. It has these tiny bumps in it, and this is the tooth of the paper. This is important to consider because as you're drawing, what's happening is your graphite is getting stuck to the ridges, those top peaks of the tooth. Unless you're pressing really hard, you're not necessarily getting any graphite down into the valleys. This is important because if you have a paper with a lot of tooth, then that tooth, those little white areas, are going to show up in your graphite, as you can see here in this little detail. And setup. I'm right-handed, so I have everything set up in a particular way. My pencils are just off to the right-hand side. My pencil sharpeners and everything else are readily available. I have a very clear line of sight to the object that I'm drawing and also my paper so that you don't have to do a lot of physical movement. And I've also set up these kind of thumbnail boxes on my paper. They're each about 4 inches by 3 inches. I drew them freehand. You could use a ruler, but I like this size because it gives you enough space to start a little sketch. Last thing to consider is how you're holding your pencil. When we're writing, we're used to holding our pencils really close to the tip and pretty tightly so that we can have a decent amount of control. It may seem counterintuitive, but for drawing, you want a little bit less control. Holding your pencil further back will allow for some freedom of motion and more expressive lines. You can hold your pencil all the way at the end or towards the middle. And also think about where you're placing your hand. Resting your fist against the paper may risk smudging your drawing. I personally like to use my pinky as a kind of stand. It stabilizes my hand and gives me more movement.